That's how long it took for the Secretary of Homeland Security to be accused of violating the Constitution, breaking the law, and turning the immigration system into a weapon. When Representative Delia Ramirez spoke during the tense hearing, her words carried the weight of outrage and conviction. She said plainly that in barely 4 months the Secretary had profiled and dehumanized communities, deported citizens of the United States, undermined the courts, and betrayed the oath of office sworn at the start of the job. For Ramirez, this was not about politics or a disagreement over policy, it was about whether the foundations of democracy could still be trusted.
To the follow-up question here, because I have a lot of them. Do you agree that Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power of the purse? Yes or no?
Yes, that is a duty.
Do you
of
believe
Congress
that,
to be
let me
able
ask
to
you another
appropriate
follow-up, it's
funds.
just yes or no. Do you believe you have the power to disregard congressional appropriations and unilaterally repurpose funds that have been duly appropriated by Congress? Yes or no?
Ma'am, we are not doing that.
So the
We are
answer to
using
you is
dollars
no.
as to
All
how
right,
they
well,
were
it was a yes or
appropriated
no,
for ensuring the
Secretary. Let me
programs have
continue.
integrity.
Interestingly, you said no. But since you've been Secretary, you have repeatedly disregarded the law. You have illegally impounded funds that Congress appropriated and that your branch of government must implement pursuant to the law. Yet you've closed offices established in law, including the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, the Office of the Immigration Detention Ombudsman, the Office of the Citizenship and Immigration Services, and you've canceled contracts for programs authorized in law, including shelter and service programs and citizenship and integration grants. You've obstructed and roughed up members of this committee as they attempted to conduct congressional oversight, and then you vilified them. But my question is, if they were so bad, why were they allowed to go in after to conduct oversight? Let me just continue. You redirected funds to terrorize our communities. You created taxpayer-funded political propaganda campaigns to terrorize families and children who don't sleep at night because of the terror of those commercials that you are putting out there. You hold sick, disrespectful press conferences in my state where, let me be clear, you are not welcome. You corruptly used emergency authority to avoid procurement to make Trump's private prison donors richer by directing $45 billion for them to expand ICE detention centers. You defunded work to address real threats to the homeland, all while you pursued college newspaper editors, labor leaders, and even a Harvard scientist who failed to declare frog embryos at the airport. Clearly, we don't have time for all my questions, so I have 13 pages worth of questions that I will be submitting to the record that I expect you and the administration to answer. But here is my final question to you. When you took your oath, did you swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America? Yes or no?
Yes, I did.
So I find that laughable. You don't behave like someone who takes that oath seriously. And let me tell you why. We don't live in a dictatorship or a monarchy. Trump's will is not the guiding doctrine of this nation, and our country is not a playground for his or your twisted authoritarian fantasies. We are a democracy. We defend the Constitution and we affirm the rule of law. We respect the co-equal branches of government and we uphold our rights, even when we disagree. The foundation of our nation is based on a core set of constitutional rights upon which our prosperity, our pluralism, and our peace depend on it. You, however, have been leading this work for 116 days, and in that time, you have profiled and dehumanized our neighbors. You've betrayed our constitutional commitment to due process. You've deported United States citizens. You've undermined the courts. You've broken the law. You've engaged in corruption, and you've weaponized the immigration system to violate civil rights. As Senator Murphy perfectly stated, your department is out of control, but you're responsible. You have betrayed the sacred fundamentals of your oath. And I believe to my core that you are not fit to hold the office. And I again, to your face, demand your immediate resignation. And I put it and place it on.
Ramirez didn't waste time with soft language. She began her questioning with a series of yes or no questions designed to corner the secretary into admitting something undeniable. Did the judiciary remain a co-equal branch of government, Did the executive branch have an obligation to honor the rulings of federal courts? Did Congress hold the power of the purse under Article 1 of the Constitution? Each time the secretary muttered agreement, giving short answers that seemed to accept the obvious. But when Ramirez pressed further, asking whether funds appropriated by Congress could be disregarded or unilaterally repurposed by the executive, the secretary stumbled. Instead of a firm denial, she dodged with carefully chosen words, "We are not doing that." Ramirez repeated that it was a yes or no question, and in that hesitation, the damage was already done. What should have been a straightforward answer turned into evidence of doubt. The Congresswoman then laid out a long list of decisions she said had broken the law. Funds approved by Congress had been impounded rather than spent as directed. Offices written into law to monitor civil rights, oversee detention centers, and provide an ombudsman for citizenship services had been closed down. Programs Congress had established for integration and shelter had been canceled without authorization. Contracts for services had been ripped up, leaving vulnerable populations without aid. And when members of Congress attempted to conduct oversight, Ramirez said they were obstructed, blocked, even physically roughed up. To her, the pattern was unmistakable. The executive branch had decided it could erase the law at will. She described propaganda campaigns paid for with taxpayer dollars that targeted immigrant families with fear. Ramirez said these weren't safety announcements but psychological weapons, ads meant to scare children into silence and make parents afraid to seek help. Families, she argued, were living in terror because the government had deliberately chosen to rule with intimidation rather than service. She accused the secretary of using emergency authority not to address genuine crises, but to enrich private detention center operators, directing tens of billions into facilities, while cutting back on programs that would actually support safety and integration. The picture she painted was one where cruelty had been given a budget, and the human consequences were devastating. By the time she reached her final lines, Ramirez was openly calling for resignation. Her voice didn't tremble as she declared that America was not a monarchy, not a dictatorship, and certainly not a place where one person's will override the Constitution. She reminded everyone listening that democracy depends on respecting co-equal branches of government and upholding rights even in moments of deep division. Then she said what few members of Congress dare to say out loud, "You have betrayed all of that, and I demand your immediate resignation." The words were not left hanging in the air but placed formally into the congressional record for all to see. What made her statement so powerful was that it wasn't framed as abstract constitutional theory, it was grounded in the everyday impact on ordinary people. Ramirez described children lying awake at night, terrified their parents could disappear. She spoke of families who no longer called 911, who avoided hospitals, who pulled their kids out of school, not because they wanted to but because they feared any interaction with the government could end in detention. This wasn't about debates in Washington, she said. It was about fear in living rooms across the country. The line that stuck with everyone who heard it was brutal in its simplicity: "This isn't policy, it's cruelty with a budget." And that cruelty, Ramirez warned, was being hidden behind excuses and silence. When asked direct constitutional questions, the secretary couldn't answer with clarity. Does Congress hold the power of the purse? Yes or no? Does the judiciary remain a co-equal branch? Yes or no? These were not complicated questions, but the answers were clouded by hesitation and avoidance. To Ramirez, that silence was more dangerous than outright denial, because it revealed a willingness to dodge the truth rather than confront it. That, she said, was how democracy crumbles, not through bold declarations, but through quiet acts of defiance against the law. The Congresswoman's words resonated far beyond the hearing room. They were a warning that the erosion of law and order doesn't begin with chaos in the streets, but with small unchecked acts inside government offices. If Congress appropriates funds and the executive impounds them without authority, what is left of balance? If courts issue rulings and officials treat them as optional, what remains of justice? Ramirez's point was simple: once those guardrails fall, rebuilding them becomes nearly impossible. She connected the dots between policy choices and lived reality. For immigrant families, the message had been clear: the government was no longer a protector but a predator. For citizens caught in wrongful deportations, due process had become a hollow promise. For communities across the country, the very agencies meant to serve them had turned into engines of fear. These weren't mistakes, Ramirez argued. They were deliberate acts carried out with intent, and that intent was to consolidate power while silencing opposition. By the end of the hearing, it was evident she wasn't merely challenging a cabinet secretary, she was fighting for the survival of constitutional order. This isn't left versus right, she concluded. This is freedom versus authoritarianism. Those words were not aimed only at her colleagues, they were aimed at the public, the families living in fear, and anyone who still believed that the Constitution's promises mattered. Ramirez defended the rule of law in a moment when it would have been easier to stay silent. She reminded the nation that democracy doesn't vanish in one dramatic collapse. It disappears slowly, when people look the other way, when small violations are excused, and when no one stands up to say enough. Her closing challenge wasn't just to the secretary sitting before her but to everyone watching. Would they stand by while power was transformed into cruelty? Would they let fear and intimidation replace law and justice? Or would they speak out, defend the principles of equality and due process, and hold leaders accountable? Ramirez made it clear that silence was not an option. Democracy, she insisted, only survives if ordinary people are willing to fight for it.